I'm David Evans. I'm a lawyer and a lobbyist. And when my kids were very young, I used to like to, they asked me, Dad, well, what do you do for a living? And at that time, I was a trial lawyer. So I tell them, I spend most of my time telling the judge what to do. Well, now my new role, after when my kids grew a little older and I became a full service lobbyist and a lobbying firm, I said, what do you do now, Dad? I told them that I now tell the legislature what to do. And oftentimes with a similar amount of success, unfortunately, they don't always listen to what we have to say. As I said, I was originally a trial lawyer. I started off in private practice with a small law firm after graduating from law school in Michigan and returning to Connecticut. I spent a couple of years with a small law firm and then got hired by the Attorney General's office. And I was an assistant attorney general for 7 years, doing general litigation, appeals mostly, a lot of human rights work, and higher education and health. And I left there, and after 7 years, I took a job. I ran for the state senate and lost by 19 votes in a 4-way primary. Was probably the best thing that ever happened because at that time the legislators paid they just gave themselves an increase in Connecticut to $40,000 a year, but it was much lower at that point. So after the Attorney General's office, I focused on banking, and one of our clients is still Wells Fargo in Connecticut. I'll talk a little about the firm, but Wells Fargo is our large banking client right now. So after the Attorney General's office, I got hired by the Connecticut Bankers Association, which was commercial banks only at that time. And I represented them for 3 or 4 years before one of the banks that were a member of the association hired me to do their government affairs. I was a vice president and then a senior vice president. And after they merged the two associations and consolidated banking in Connecticut, allowing for interstate and full nationwide banking, I left and formed my own lobbying firm, and I do a little bit of legal work still. And the lobbying firm, one of the anchor clients was at the time the predecessor in Connecticut to Wells Fargo. It was Northeast Bancorp that got taken by First Union, got taken by, First Fidelity, First Union, Wachovia, and then Wells Fargo. And we've continued to represent them over the course of the years. In 1990, I formed Evans and Associates. I was of counsel to the law firm of Brown, Panderas and Scott, where we still share space with them and share a relationship with them. And in 1990, we went private and built our a list of clients that many of which we have and continue to represent. Among our various associates is Laurie Julian, who's been with us probably 8 to 10 years now. I don't know exactly, time flies, but Laurie brings a lot of expertise, particularly because of her advanced degree in the health area. She's also an attorney, but she'll talk about her qualifications. Evans Associates is in Hartford, Connecticut, a full service lobbying firm that Danielle, who's on this call, knows very well because we've worked with her. And among our clients, we know both sides of the issue, because at one point we represented the emergency room physicians way back, and they're now currently represented by another group. But we're very familiar with the issues of doctors, and we're constantly banging heads with them. Among our clients are the title companies, a mental health association, a special needs group, the cemeteries, the hospital pharmacists, and the Brainerd Airport Association, a variety of various interests and various clients. And we bring, and the other associates bring a tremendous amount of experience and expertise, either having been involved in the political process as I was. I started way back when I was in law school. I spent a summer in Washington, D.C. And I worked for the National Association of Electric Companies as a legislative intern. And that kind of whetted my appetite for what goes on in the legislative process. And then I slowly circumvented back to that role in Connecticut. And as we tell all our clients, even though they've got various rules as they have in the courts on what goes on, the one golden rule is that there are no rules, because every time the legislature passes a rule or makes a statement as to how they're going to proceed, they get around it or make an exception. It's important to know for all your members and all nurses that most legislators respond to two things. They respond to money and votes, and that's their primary drive. And votes more than money, but money is right up there, and we continue to be involved with various candidates and getting involved in their campaign. And that's one of the things that we always recommend to our clients, particularly the nurses. And we recently, Laurie and I were at the annual meeting of the Connecticut APRNs, or nurse practitioners, and they asked us a similar question: how can we be more effective? And how you can be more effective is getting involved, getting to know who your legislators are. I asked for a show of hands, who knew who their senator was and who knew their representative. And I was surprised to see that many of hands went up. But it's more important, as important as getting to know your legislator, is getting APRNs involved in the political process. And that means running for office. There are doctors in the legislature, and in fact, the co-chair of our current public health committee is a physician, and he's co-chair of the public health committee. So everything that any expansion or any issues we want have to go through that doctor, because he controls the agenda. And we have a part-time, supposedly, legislature in Connecticut. They are in for 5 months in the odd number of years, and we just completed a long session, and we're now going into the short session, which begins in February and ends in May. And in the short session, the agenda before the Public Health Committee, where most of our legislation runs, is controlled by the chairs of the committee, because they only allow committee bills in the short session. And without getting into a course on legislation in Connecticut, it's so important to be able to convince the chairs of the Public Health Committee and the ranking members that they should proceed with one particular agenda. And when it's controlled by doctors, it makes it much more difficult. So we have maybe 3 nurses in the legislature, either in, there's 1 senator and maybe 2 reps, and Laurie can talk about that are friends. But if we were able to encourage more individuals to run for public office and get involved in the process and get involved in leadership, it makes it so much easier. They get tired of hearing us over and over, and they see our faces up there. So involvement by the rank and file of nurse practitioners is so important. Back 7 years ago, we managed to expand for the nurse practitioners their role in Connecticut. They can practice independently, but as part of that deal to make that happen, we had to agree that new individuals that graduate from school and want to get involved in the process, they have to have a collaborator, and the collaborator has to be a doctor.
And that's a good example. Just if I interject, because at that time I recall it was a APRN who was on the public health committee, and she I'm pretty sure, I think she had a chairmanship position. It was might have been vice chair, Conroy, and and that was extremely helpful in getting the legislation through, and particularly because there were a lot of legislators, and one who actually, oh yes, and that's right, she was vice chair, I think, because at the time the current speaker of the House, Matt Ritter, was the chair, and his wife is a nurse, is a doctor, but he was quite open to I do believe, because Teresa Conroy was on the committee as vice chair in helping get the APRN independent practice legislation through. So it just shows how important it is really to have voices within. Yeah.
Yeah, and not only is the current speaker's wife a physician, but there's a number of ranking members on the Public Health Committee whose spouses or significant others are doctors. So that's a constant battle that we have, and that's why it's important to encourage nurse practitioners to run, to reach out, particularly now before when they serve a 2-year term in Connecticut and Senate and the House, to reach out now to talk to their various senators or reps, so that if we have an issue, and we have a number of issues, including a global signature, which allows at the moment only doctors to sign, even if it's within the scope of a licensed practicing nurse, to sign order, it has to be signed by a doctor, even though she or he should be able to sign that order. So that's another issue that we're grappling with. We found out that there's multiple
disciplines that are in the Public Health Committee, because they all seem to have different agendas. The physicians are going to be more in line with what the AMA says. The nurses are going to be more in line with what our nursing research and backgrounds say about, the safe nursing practice and our outcomes. So you almost have this war of different disciplines going on all the time. And I can say for me, it's very frustrating, because I feel like there's so many physicians there that why even bother? Are they ever really going to listen to me? Because historically they haven't been amenable to anything that's very different from them. So is there, any better view?
Yeah, tackle that, and that's a really good point, Leanne. I think it's not going to change. I think there'll always be that tension. Just by the Public Health Committee is known as a turf battle ground, I should say. That's just how Public Health Committee is known. And I think it's just important that we not be afraid. The role, and this is what I think is important to stress, is that your role is to educate the legislators. So they have their points. we've got our points. Access is such a big issue now. There's a shortage of nurses, there's a shortage of healthcare access. And that's why it's so important to just be out there educating every legislator to what you do and how the current policy can be restrictive and how that impacts the access for your patients. I think it's important also to stress the role that you play for your patients. It's consumerism, really. I think the legislators respond very well to how it impacts the consumer, and I think they have their life experiences too. So, for instance, and we're really pleased with the new health policy. The new House chair. She's very open. She's got a social work background, but I guess what I'm trying to say is legislators bring in their personal experiences too, and she knows from trying to make appointments for her mother that she realizes how long it is to wait for a doctor's appointment. So again, it's the importance of bringing in these personal experiences to your legislators, and so that's basically, I guess, in a roundabout way, how I would respond to just continue to let the legislators know your role. And I think, as you know, healthcare is changing. It's expansive. It's not right, David. We do run up against that with the medical society as the old school. Doctors stay in their lane. And I've even been told by the Senate chair, you stay in your lane and we stay in our lane. But that's not the way. It's not so rigid anymore. And we have to educate. That's I guess what I'm trying to say is continue to educate.
Laurie, why don't you explain a little about your background and how you got into lobbying?
Yes. Well, actually, I did go to law school, and I'm probably one of the few law students, maybe not so much anymore, but at that time, I knew that I did not want to practice law per se. I really actually had more interest in affecting policy, and I think that's because other than your big cases, the Roe versus Wade cases of that magnitude, most of the court cases that you deal with are impacting individuals. So that's why I was very interested in policy, because you are able to make, I feel, much more of a difference, widespread difference. So I went to school in the evening. UConn, which is our local University of Connecticut, and I went in the evenings. And actually, during that time, I was working for the Attorney General's office as a paralegal, and I had taken the one course which I very much liked with Judge Satter, but he's since passed, but he was a legislator, and so he taught the legislative process course, and I really said, oh yes, I'd like to be involved with the policy end. Well, during the time I graduated, it wasn't a great economy. So in a roundabout way, I basically did it backwards. I went and got my master's in public health. I was working for an insurance company, and I ended up getting my master's in public health. And and I did that in the evening, and then upon graduation, I worked for the Association of Community Health Centers, and then I worked I worked on some legislation for health reform, and then I also worked for the Alzheimer's Association before coming to David Evans. So yes, so I have a big concentration in healthcare. And then, as I say, I've been with David for about I believe 9 years now, and I really enjoy the variety of issues that are up at the Capitol. And so I bring this to your attention. I think this is a good segue to say, for proper, not proper, but messaging purposes, and know that the legislature has a plethora of different issues. I mean, I think we have in Connecticut on the state level, 23 different committees of different cognizance. So you can imagine that what each legislator goes through. And but even though a legislator might serve on a certain committee, and maybe he or she doesn't sit on the public health committee or the insurance committee, we do a lot with them as well. It's still important because constituency matters. And even though they may not sit on the committee, they are able to maybe take interest in your issue, or maybe they, right, Danielle, you, I think with Senator Cohen, I think you had that example. And they're able to talk to the other legislators, say, this is an important issue for me. There's a lot of horse trading going on, particularly at the end. So it's all important. Again, I think building a relationship with your legislator. And again, as that said, you want to be able to be put things in very simple terms as far as how this policy will impact your patient, or access me as a professional, a health professional. And just know that we often like to, you probably heard of saying the elevator pitch, because sometimes they can only break things down into small concepts, because it's very very difficult unless they're on the committee to get into the detail. So it's just very important when you speak to them, know that they do have a lot of other issues pressing them as well. So I guess that would be my recommendation, and is say just the importance of building a relationship and getting out there.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that's a great piece of advice. I mean, I even just worked with Senator Cohen, Christine Cohen is my senator, recently around some electric vehicle stuff, which is sort of something very close to her heart and something very close to my heart, which, after years of having a relationship with her around nurse practitioner issues, was something that we could also join around. So I think that's super important to, if you were to have like no experience at all, if you were just paying attention even to the legislation in general, and a legislator brought up an issue about workplace staffing ratios, or anything that caught your eye, and you wanted to write some testimony or work with your statewide professional organization and craft something to put your opinion about, that would be a great way to kind of enter the forum and show your support as a professional, and educate them and build relationship. That's a great way to kind of step into the policy arena, and be really positive. Again, working with your state organization, which is a great way to get involved and meet your lobbyists that way. And then you can kind of start building those relationships and affecting change in really great ways. So it's a wonderful way to start building some trust, which is wonderful. And then there are, like Laurie was saying, there are then all these opposing, perhaps different opinions about the public health forum. But policymakers can then appreciate our points of view, which sometimes are different than other leadership's points of view about how public health is delivered. So it's helpful. It's very, very helpful.
And that's it too. You made a good point, Danielle. If you know, credibility is important, establishing credibility, building the relationship. And if you don't know an answer, they said, if you don't know an answer, you can get back to them. Don't be afraid that they might ask me something and I don't know. You just say, I will get back to you. And to making that first open introduction. Oftentimes now that we have information about some background about your legislator, but again, like David said, they respond to money and votes and constituency. I think, say, constituency matters. You often have a front seat up there because you are a constituent, and that's what they're in there for. And I think also, I guess, I mean, I can speak to the Connecticut legislature, but I think is knowing that they're people, and for the most part, most of them want to do good. They do. It's not sometimes, they're there late at night. They have a lot of votes they have to vote on, and it's I wouldn't say it's necessarily an easy job, and responding to constituents calls and I guess just knowing that they're people, and so it's not, sometimes I think people are afraid to approach them, is that they're sort of this mighty or what have you, unapproachable, but they're there for you. And I think just approaching it in that manner.
And I'd like to point out that during the legislative session, and Leah's came up and Danielle's come up, we've actually had our APRNs at the Capitol when our key legislation is advancing. And that's so important because money and votes, I said votes first, but so when it's a constituent that shows up at the Capitol or a call, those are the two primary ways of communicating. Because of the COVID, it's more difficult to reach them, but a text or an email. And what some legislators do at the very end of the session, when they maybe get 5,000 emails because they're dealing with a number of bills toward the end, they weed out the ones that aren't constituents, and they respond to the constituents first because that's votes. So it's important that you build that relationship with a legislator before you actually need it. And Danielle, of course, is a veteran and has done that for us in the past, where we can call on her and she can call on Senator Cohen or whoever happens to be her senator or rep at the time. And it's so important because, we have a more difficult time because of the COVID rules, and a lot of it's virtual, and they stay in their offices now with the concern about COVID. And so it's important that people like, and constituents like Danielle have access. And we try to gather cell phone numbers, because if you call in on the main number, they put you in the queue. But if you have their cell phone, I've talked to Senator Cohen twice this week, and she's not courteous enough to pick up the cell phone call. And where if I tried to reach her in the normal process, you call the main number and they say they'll get back to you, or they have an aide get back to you. So it's key to have that close contact such as Danielle does. And I know Leah was up at the Capitol during the course of the last session. And that's so important because they make a time for you to come out and talk to you. And I've said enough. Are there any questions? We're happy to answer questions.
Sure. I'm more interested in establishing some helpful guidelines for your frontline nurses who perhaps even though we can explain the wealth of knowledge that we might have and specific health knowledge and specific witnessing of health issues with our patient populations, I don't think that all the time a frontline nurse will consider themselves someone who is a leader or an expert. So I'd like to find a way to organize educational information for nurses to become more civically engaged, to recognize how they have influence with informal authority and what expertise means in terms of, for example, years of service in the profession or otherwise. And from a political standpoint or a legislative standpoint, what does that mean? What can be described as a way that someone might see a list of things that somebody in that realm thinks is helpful on an issue, and they can read that and say, oh, I have that much experience. I have that specific knowledge. Maybe what I can bring to the table is worthy. I'm not just lost in the front lines. And more of a guide as to how to do that, because I think it's also very difficult for someone to just, maybe they're not all, and maybe not every personality is one that would feel comfortable just cold calling a legislator. But if they had a step or a guideline or understood the background processes, what aides are involved, who can actually bring that message to the top, a little bit more of a guideline to, hey, if you think you might want to reach out, here's a specific way that you can start.
Well, I think it's important. You've hit on a few really important points, and it's important to let the association and your lobbyists know what expertise you have. For instance, with Danielle, whose focus is on the mental health area, it's almost like a subset within the association. But if we have a specific question on that involves children's health or adult health, we turn to Danielle or counterparts, and there's a small group that are more active than others. And let me give you an example. Way back when I was with the Bankers Association, one of our banks was very, very politically wired. What they asked of all their employees, that they do a political involvement and a civic involvement. And just about every legislator needed a treasurer. So they had a banker who had volunteered to be the treasurer of that legislature. So they, on the inside, constantly talking to the legislator and apprising them of what their issues are and what their concerns. So it's important, to get back to your point, it's important that the association as well as the lobbyist knows what somebody's particular expertise is, so that it can be tapped in and utilized. And when that individual finds out who the legislator, call them up and say, do you have time for coffee, or can we chat? I'm Mary Jones or John Jones, and I live in your district, and I'm an APRN, and I have this expertise. So you build a relationship with them, and you let them know what you can help them with, because they have so many issues that they can't possibly educate themselves on all these. So Laurie's got the point. We have an obligation to educate them, and we have an obligation to utilize the expertise of the individuals that we have to do that. That's a long answer to a short question.
And that also leads me just to add, so through the association, the expertise, and I think with the APRNs particularly, you're in different areas, home care, it can be children's mental health, all different areas. And also, don't be afraid to look outside if it's a particular issue that you might want to build coalitions with other groups that might, we find that also helpful too, just to build your base. Oh, okay, I don't know.
And I add
Button
something
here.
to that.
Mhm.
What Grace was talking about, getting nurses at the grassroots involved in policy and letting them, feel like they have a voice and they, not be bashful about it. I think a starting point would also be with the Student Nurses Association while they're in school. That's a good
Yes.
place for us to empower them so they can see, what that is about. So, at least from that exposure, they will feel confident and know, what's involved, what the landscape is like.
And they, very good point. And I'm thinking of our pharmacy students, because they often come up with their white coats, and the hospital pharmacies come up, and how effective that is. And legislators respond very well to young people and people getting into the field, and so that is a really good point, Sandra. Tapping into the students.
Grace's point, I like the idea of coming up with maybe a game plan or maybe a list of tips. Now, when I became interested in this, I had no background in it. I had been working in corrections, and I had been a minor, and my knuckles were kind of calloused over from dragging on the ground. I had no connection with this world of professionals. And so I was a little nervous. So the first thing that I did is I went to the basement of the Capitol one day and had coffee. And then I started going down there once a week just to have coffee or something so I'd feel comfortable. Then I sat up and I watched a session. Then I went and sat in on the committee meetings, and I was interested in workplace violence. And so I sat in on the healthcare committee, and I started getting comfortable with how the process works, so it wasn't so scary. And then eventually I was able to feel comfortable enough to testify. And so I think the first thing, and David started out with this, just get started. I mean, we're creative people. We know how to do stuff. And I don't think we need to have everything all laid out for us ahead of time. That would be helpful. But I think the big thing is just getting started. We're a missing voice. And because of that, I think there's a lot of problems in our healthcare system because the voice of the nurse and the perception of the nurse is simply not there.
And I think that's a
And
great.
one of the things, I'm
The
sorry.
guide can start with just that. This is where you can go as a citizen, as in the civil arena. You can just show up and start listening. I think even that bit of information is unknown at this time.
I agree. And in my PhD work, when I was teaching for Leah, when I was teaching the DNP students, it's part of their training now, the sort of new APRNs, that I guess one of their essentials is that they need to go do that work. So, and a piece of this is that. So I think it's wonderful. It's sort of a new, the bar is sort of raised, and that civic led work, and sort of my goal is now to bring it to that BSN level, because I think the bedside nurse, particularly with the nursing shortages and the level of workplace violence now that is just astronomical, particularly in acute care settings. And actually now the mental health settings in Connecticut, we just had a behavioral health nurse who was killed last week. We have to address this. So one of the ways we address this is to get nurses really astute at speaking to legislators so they can, talk their reality, and inform them about how policies need to change to keep them safe, and practicing in evidence-based ways, so that we can translate the research that we're generating. Those of us in the science end of things can get it generated and translated into practice. So I think that's brilliant in so many ways.
Yes, and it's so important because the pushback we get is from this old scale mentality that the doctors ought to supervise all nurses, etc. So as the young nurses get out of school, they make them understand how important it is to educate, as Laurie said, legislators as to what the role is and how they can provide care that's so needed and so absent, particularly in some of the rural areas of Connecticut, for that matter.
Yeah. And to Daniel's point, that aspect could be incorporated into the leadership courses for the BSN students.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that is so necessary. Absolutely. That's a great, great point.
My first question, I think, was answered when Grace spoke earlier, and some of the earlier speakers, but I just typed in, so how does someone who's, not in school, who's actually I'm retired at the moment, but who's, practicing APRN, how would you know when there are sessions to attend if you want to, Michael's unusual. He just went to the Capitol and somehow figured out how to, where to go, who to talk to, when to attend the session. But, I don't know exactly how someone like myself would, know exactly when to come to something about, let's say, workplace violence or people being offered various types of health insurance, things like that.
Well, the answer to that is you reach out to your association, number one. As you can imagine, there's over 2,000 bills in a long session, and there's of those probably maybe a couple of hundred actually become law. So if you reach out to your association, and we offer to any member of the association to contest us directly, we know when the committees of various issues are happening. We read all the bills. We provide a bill book to the association so they know when a particular issue is being up for a hearing or is being considered, and we provide a bill book every week. It's updated for members of the association, particularly the leadership. So the legislative arm of the association would be a good resource or a good contact point for any nurse that wants to get involved and learn more about what's happening at the Capitol. There's work groups going on right now on a variety of issues, and we're watching all those very carefully. We participate. We've managed to get a work group on allowing APRNs to be collaborators as well as doctors, and Laurie did an excellent job in arranging for that. So go ahead, Laurie.
No, I was just going to say, yes, it's generally through your state APRN, as David said, association, because it's really, yes, it's during, and say whatever state you're in, they operate differently. And so for instance, in our state, that's why we have to monitor so closely, because a public hearing can come up. They only have to notice in our state, Connecticut, 5 days prior, which doesn't give too much time. So it's really, yes, that you rely on your state association. I know that they do have, they must have, each state has a website, their own legislative website. They should, and they notice, but it might be difficult to understand or when that might come up. So I think it's best first to rely on your state association. Mm-hmm.
Part of the problem
Yes.
with that is that not all associations are able to become involved in politics. Some of them, if they're organized as a 501c3, they would violate their nonprofit status with the IRS if they become at all engaged in particular issues or particular politicians. And so the executive directors are terrified that their members are going to go and represent the organization when they can't. And so I think sometimes the organizations downplay participating policy because they don't teach their members how to do that without involving. Now maybe some of the organizations, like I know ANA They have the political wing, they have a PAC, and the advanced practice nurses probably have a section that are they're organized to do that. So that might sound like they should be able to, but it's something for folks to be aware of. The other thing is, I know in Oregon, they have a very good alert system. So if you sign up for particular committees, they will tell you the agenda ahead of time, and when they're meeting, you're on their list. So, and that might take a little, like you said, it might be a little cumbersome to figure out how to get on that. And that might be something we do, create some kind of tutorial about how to get on that list of the issues that you're interested in.
That's a really important point. I'm glad you made that, Michael. I think that's why I put that my response in the chat that way, that it's important to check with when somebody had asked about like how you would find a lobbyist, or because some of the state organizations are not structured like they are in Connecticut, or like many of them are. So I'm so glad you pointed that out. So, but it's not a bad question, you know, if you were to contact your state organization and ask, like, do you have a government relations committee? You know, do you work with a lobbyist? Those aren't like bizarre questions to ask. And if they don't, as if they're structured like Michael was pointing out, then they'll tell you that, you know, they have 503c prohibitions or something. And they might even direct you about, you know, how you could get involved in other ways. And some of the other ways, like I'm a big fan of like, and you may have heard this from other people, like nurses on boards. I think it's really important to just sort of find a passion that you might think is really cool to yourself, and get involved in your local communities. That's another great way that you can affect policy and have nursing and nurse practitioning at the advanced practice level, just be very present and build relationships. So I've served on lots of different boards. My kids' baseball board in town. A colleague of mine actually has been on the Board of Education, which is that's a very highfalutin board that can lead to some political power, which I never thought about, but that's really cool. So there's lots of ways that you can bring this voice, this very pointed healthcare perspective and voice into policy arenas that then affect legislative and policy changes that you wouldn't necessarily think about, but are kind of sneaky in cool ways. So just really quickly, as an example, when I was on the baseball board, there was a lot of debate about a concussion policy that people on the board who were primarily financial guys and had no desire to import into our system. But I pressed hard and had brought a very different perspective, and we ultimately adopted that into our baseball league. But again, I don't think that people would have necessarily appreciated that and the importance of having that in our public playing field political arena, and our little boys' heads might not have been so protected. So it's a good place to just sort of exercise your expertise and help out the community, which again builds rapport with policymakers and legislators who also have kids in those communities, or whatever it is that you're kind of passionate about.
So would it be best not only to go to your state professional organization, but let's say like a city council, and ask about getting on committees, things like that?
Absolutely, that's a great idea. I just got asked by one of our town officials that was just re-elected to help out on the committee that looks at elder housing, because they wanted somebody with healthcare expertise and also a lot of connections in the community to get the word out and also advise on, you know, policies and how they might find recipients for the grant money they're receiving, and just all sorts of things that they needed help with. And you normally wouldn't think of it as being a hot spot for health policy, but they definitely needed someone.
I'm going to have to get off. I'm having some work done and so I'm going to have to get off shortly. I just have to attend to something. If
okay, yeah,
So great to
that's
see
fine.
you.
If you have any other thoughts, you know, some other tips, feel free to email me and I could share that with everybody.
And I would
absolutely.
like to say that it's a pleasure to be here today for Laurie and I. I've got another commitment also very shortly. But feel free. I think if you don't see our contact information, Michael can direct you to us, and I'm happy to take any calls. Call me on our cell phone, or you can talk to Laurie or myself. We're happy to have further conversations if you need be.
Okay, and thank you for your time and enthusiasm. And really, it's you have a right to for your legislators to listen to you.
Thank you so much, David and Laurie. I really appreciate your time. It's been extremely helpful.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Okay, you too.
Go out.